Hi, this conference has been years in the planning, and much has happened both globally and in my own life since Russell's generous invitation. I sent him a title then, Infinite Virtue, Shakespeare and Capacity, not quite knowing where those phrases would send me. Infinite virtue comes from Antony and Cleopatra, an exchange between the two lovers after Antony's unexpected but brief victory at Alexandria. He greets her as this great fairy, and she responds by affirming his infinite virtue. Infinite virtue echoes the infinite variety associated with Cleopatra herself. Infinite virtue taps a capacious, vitalist virtue discourse that is Roman in its identification of virtue with virility, but more broadly Hellenistic and Egyptian in its gesture at a landscape of powers or capacities that pulse and ripple between and beyond persons, genders, languages, and cults or cultures to resound within the cosmos itself. So what about Cleopatra as this great fairy? At the heart of Cleopatra's political theology is her identification with Isis, the Egyptian goddess who had already tarried with ancient Near Eastern and Greek religions before becoming Hellenized throughout the Mediterranean. Isis was also welcomed at Rome. Plutarch identifies Isis with what he calls the female principle of nature in her mode of becoming. Quote, she turns herself into this or that thing and is receptive to all manner of shapes and forms. Plutarch's description of Isis overlaps with aspects of woman wisdom in Hebrew wisdom literature, a mixed body of works that responded to Canaanite, Egyptian, and Greek motifs from within a consolidating monotheism. A hymn discovered on a papyrus in Egypt in 1896 enumerates a truly global itinerary for Isis, who declares her presence among the Amazons and among the Indians, among other locales. So the Isis mythos tapped by Cleopatra sounds infinite virtue in its cosmic plenitude, its feminine aspect, and its cross-cultural reach. The topic of our conference is transformation. In the classical world, Isis and her avatars were sources of animate change in nature, as well as more personal healing and renewal. I'm also interested in the transformations of Isis, including her affinities with the woman wisdom of Hebrew wisdom writing. And I'd like to follow the transformations of Sophianic women across Shakespeare's works. My plays today are A Midsummer Night's Dream and Antony and Cleopatra. But what about the transformational capacities or virtues of Shakespeare's plays themselves? How do the plays change us? What attitudes and comportments allow us to glimpse the infinite virtue that Shakespeare found and refigured in mythopoetic and scriptural traditions and make some tendril of that virtue real in our lives? These questions are always the horizon of my work. I began developing these readings of Midsummer and Antony and Cleopatra in a community seminar on Shakespeare and wisdom literature that I co-taught last spring with Sean Kylan. During that same period, I was studying the Book of Psalms with two synagogue groups, one in California and one in New York, the magic of Zoom. Cycling through my roles as scholar, as community teacher, and as lay learner, I am repeatedly awed by the capacity of texts to speak to each other and to us about matters of communal and personal transformation. So these remarks then come out of a broader effort to think with Shakespeare about virtue and wisdom in the world. So what did Shakespeare know about Isis? Well, the major Isis source for early Shakespeare is Apuleius's The Golden Ass, also called The Metamorphoses, a key intertext for A Midsummer Night's Dream. This picaresque novel about a man who is transformed into a donkey ends with an epiphany of the goddess Isis on the shores of Corinth, where the goddess instructs him how to regain his human form by participating in her festival. Both Apuleius and the later Shakespeare would have learned about Isis from Plutarch, who wrote an essay on Isis and Osiris that was translated into English in 1603. The narrator of the Golden Ass claims to be a descendant of Plutarch, and both Apuleius and Plutarch were Platonists and priests. Isis also shows up in Ovid's Metamorphoses, where Io, regaining her human form at the edge of the Nile, merges with the cult of Isis. And then Isis reappears in the Metamorphoses as a goddess of childbirth, but also of sex change, in the story of Iphis and Ianthe, the transgender story that would be adopted by Lily in Galatea and by Shakespeare in Twelfth Night. Ovid's Amores include a poem to Isis and her capacity as goddess of pregnancy and childbirth on the occasion of Corinna's abortion, a fascinating text. In 1596, around the same time as Midsummer, Spenser published the second edition of The Faerie Queen, which included the Isis Church sequence, a Plutarchan and Apuleian fantasy that takes place in the land of Faerie. There are also manifold references to Isis in books of the period, largely derived from Apuleius, Plutarch, and Herodotus, and sometimes worked into a scriptural world history in which Osiris, who's now the son of Cham and the grandson of Noah, brings agriculture to lands as far away as Ethiopia, Britain, and Hungary. His achievements included teaching the Britons to make beer instead of wine, which I love. I'd also like to pursue the idea that Isis enters Shakespeare's world as an unacknowledged presence in Hebrew wisdom literature, especially the late deuterocanonical books included in the Septuagint, which was commissioned by the Ptolemies and is an Alexandrian project through and through. The woman wisdom of the Book of Solomon or Book of Wisdom draws on Isis imagery in shaping a female partner for God in creation. This Judeo-Greek Sophia integrates Stoic, Platonic, Egyptian, and Pythagorean motifs of transformation, borrowing from Isis and given a local habitation and a name in the character of Sheba, foreign visitor and kindred philosopher at Solomon's court. Sophia's Egyptian and Ethiopian avatars serve to internationalize Hebrew wisdom literature. So across these texts, Isis appears as an Egyptian goddess of the Nile who is melded with Venus and Diana in order to sublimate further into Sophia and the virtuous virtuosity of creation itself. Apuleius himself was a provincial intellectual in North Africa, and classicists have begun reading his text for signs of his mixed identity as an Afro-Platonist. Apuleius's Elizabethan translator, Adlington, introduces him this way: Lucas Apuleius African, an excellent follower of Plato his sect, born in Madura, a country sometime inhabited by the Romans, and lying on the borders of Numidia and Getulia, whereby he calleth himself half a Numidian and half a Getulian. At once establishing the author's African origins and affirming his yellow-haired whiteness, Adlington ends with a cross-gender identification of Apuleius as the nurse of Carthage and the celestial muse and venerable mistress of Afrique. In this extravagant phrase, Apuleius merges not only with his character Lucius, but also with Isis herself. Mauritania had been ruled by the African king Juba II and Cleopatra Selene, the daughter of Cleopatra the Great. And their adoption of Isis and Osiris imagery strategically integrated Roman, African, and Egyptian elements. So Apuleius was writing his novel in a setting where Isis presided as both a neighboring local deity and a universal principle of natural becoming. In her sublime self-description to Lucius in the Golden Ass, Isis announces herself as the goddess of goddesses in a global geography. Behold, Lucius, I am come. Thy weeping and prayers hath moved me to succor thee. I am she that is the natural mother of all things, mistress and governess of all the elements, the initial progeny of worlds, chief of the powers divine, queen of heaven, the principle of the gods celestial, the light of the goddesses. At my will, the planets of the air, the wholesome winds of the seas, and the silences of hell be disposed. My name, my divinity, is adored throughout all the world in diverse manners, in variable customs, and in many names. For the Phrygians call me the mother of the gods, the Athenians, Minerva, the Cyprians, Venus, but principally the Ethiopians, which dwell in the Orient, and the Egyptians, which are excellent in all kind of ancient doctrine, and by their proper ceremonies accustomed to worship me, do call me Queen Isis. So Isis oversees manifold cults and customs, as well as natural forces and powers, a plurality aptly captured by the phrase progeny of worlds. Apuleius's exaltation of Isis as an international goddess bespeaks his own cosmopolitanism as a North African who spoke Greek, wrote in Latin, and whose mother tongue may have been Punic. In Apuleius in Africa, Wiste Cule argues that the description of the hair of Isis as curly, intorti, and dispersi signals her African Libyan appearance. And he suggests that the ass's own, quote, thick, bristly, curly hair may signal an African feature that Lucius shares with Isis. In the Polyalbion, Michael Drayton associates Isis's hair with a species of black coral, evocative of her Ethiopian cult. In Apuleius, Isis wears a vestment of fine silk yielding diverse colors, sometimes yellow, sometimes rosy, sometimes flamy, and sometimes, which troubled my spirit sore, dark and obscure. The multicolored undergarment represents the mutability of nature, as well as the geographical dispersion of the goddess herself. The black cloak wound around this gown evokes not only the nighttime sky, but also the urge towards interpretation that such wisdom goddesses solicit. Isis donned a black robe when she gathered the scattered body parts of Osiris, an act that became an emblem for the hermeneutic projects and Orphic research of the Renaissance. The manifold robes of Isis in Apuleius resemble the temples of Isis in Plutarch. And like as the rainbow is a representation of the sun, and the same distinguished by sundry colors by the refraction of our eyesight against a cloud, even so this fable is an appearance of some doctrine or learning, which doth reflect and send back our understanding to the consideration of some other truth, much after the manner of sacrifices, wherein there is mingled a kind of lamentable dull and sorrowful heaviness. Semblably, the making and disposition of temples, which in some places have fair open aisles and pleasant alleys open overhead, and in others, dark caves, vaults, and shrouds under the earth. Plutarch's rainbow imagery communicates the refracted view of the truth afforded by myth, as well as the variety and mutability of the natural world. Her temples are divided between open galleries and dark cellarage, evoking the management of mysteries and the strata of mythographic interpretation. Apuleius and Plutarch allow these iridescent images and shadowy undersongs to flicker across time and space. In the words of Apuleius, Isis, quote, illuminates all the borders of the earth with her feminine shape. So where and how does this theophany of Isis and its hermeneutic and iconographic refractions color Shakespeare's great fairies, Titania and Cleopatra? In A Midsummer Night's Dream, Isis is never mentioned by name, and she enters only obliquely, carried on the back, as it were, of Apuleius's golden ass. We might sense her presence, however, in Theseus's wry statement about the madness of the lover who, quote, sees Helen's beauty in a brow of Egypt. Beyond its casual racism, the image communicates the syncretic process by which Hellenic goddesses merged with Egyptian ones. The play is scattered with references to Ethiops, lovely Jews, and tawny Tartars that reflect beauty's wanderings. When Theseus depicts the eye of the poet in fine frenzy rolling, he evokes a Vedic wisdom tradition shared with Plato, Orpheus, and Pythagoras, all of whom were said to have studied in Egypt. And this Pythagorean Platonism, it was diverse in fact as well as in myth, as seen in the transmigrations of Plato in Islamic Sufism and Jewish Kabbalah. James McPeak has pointed out that the words progeny and governess from Adlington's translation of Apuleius appear in Titania's long speech about climate change. What is orderly in the speech of Isis has come undone in the speech of Titania, but both deities manage a dynamic cosmos composed of interdependent systems of weather, agriculture, and cult. So Shakespeare was recollecting bits of Isis when he composed Titania's longest and most explicitly environmental speech. Both are moon, weather, and fertility goddesses who draw multiple feminine divinities into their sublime aura, and both appear to ass men. In Apuleius, the theophany occurs at the end of the book. It initiates Lucius's transformation back into a human being, paralleling the wanderings of Io and her becoming Isis on the banks of the Nile. Shakespeare breaks the theophany in two parts: Titania's first encounter with Bottom, and then Bottom's recollection of his dream the following day. Shakespeare's intentions are largely comic, of course, sending Lucius back into his ludic travails, but traces of the sublimity of Apuleius's Isis book linger, as Jan Kott and others have argued. Titania awakes to the sound of Bottom awkwardly comforting himself with a simple song. And here is her over-the-top response. What angel wakes me from my flowery bed? I pray thee, gentle mortal, sing again. Mine ear is much enamored of thy note, so is mine eye enthralled to thy shape, and thy fair virtue's force perforce doth move me on the first view to swear, I love thee. Now, in Apuleius, the goddess appears to the creature, who gratefully receives her eritology and instruction. In Shakespeare, it is really the creature who is revealed to the goddess, who experiences fair virtue's force in his voice and shape. Her comic debasement by Oberon immerses her in the life processes that she oversees. Eye and ear become erotic portals for a stream of impressions that attach to Bottom's ridiculous person, insofar as he channels the thicket teeming around them. In this Bottom-heavy theophany, they are both initiates into the mysteries of fair virtue's force. According to at least one line of thought in the history of religions, what distinguished the divinities of the mystery cults, including Isis, Eleusinian Ceres, and Orpheus Dionysus, was their own mortality, their own participation in the cycle of birth, death, and renewal. The goddess has descended, and having creaturely life reveal itself to her, Titania partakes in the mystery she administers. When Bottom awakes, his parody of St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians cleverly recalls Lucius's own return to Corinth and to human form. And behind Paul lie other wisdom texts: the Jewish Platonist Leone Abreu, praising the imagination, cites Ecclesiastes. Quote, Solomon says that the eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. So now it is bottom's ear and eye that surge beyond their normative capacities in order to grasp the sound of the world, speaking in broken paradoxes that invite the real to shine through. Our oafish Orpheus is composing his own wisdom poem. In the Golden Ass, Isis appears to Lucius rising from the sea, a posture from the pictorial tradition that culminates in Botticelli's Birth of Venus and also animates Plutarch's and Shakespeare's descriptions of Cleopatra at Cydnus. The maritime cult of Isis Pelagia, accompanied by a sail that often flowed into the depiction of her clothing, became widespread along the Greek and Asian Minor coastline, including Corinth. The main seaside in Midsummer is the one recollected by Titania in her elegy for the Indian votaress. Isis presided over childbirth, as Ovid dramatizes in his abortion poem in the Amores. As a votaress, the Indian queen is the member of a female worship community, like the cults dedicated to Isis across the Hellenized world. Ovid's Corinna is also a votaress. Ovid reminds Isis that his mistress, quote, oft hath served thee upon certain days. The frescoes in the Temple of Isis, or Iseum at Pompeii, represent Roman women, freedmen, and enslaved people of several ethnicities worshiping the goddess. In the same temple, the image of Io being greeted by Isis are part of a narrative of colonization that was used first by the Ptolemies and then by the Romans to legitimize control of Egypt. So in Midsummer, the worship of Titania crosses continents in search of a Sophianic female community, a scene riven by imperial ambitions with roots deep in the same mythic material. The Isis festival at the end of the Golden Ass describes a model ship filled with votive offerings and then sent down the shoreline to Isis's temple. The great priest did dedicate and consecrate a fair ship made very cunningly. The sail was of white linen cloth, whereon was written certain letters which testified the navigation to be prosperous. The mast was of a great length, made of a pine tree, round, very excellent with a shining top. The cabin was covered over with coverings of gold, and all the ship was made of citron tree, very fair. Then all the people took a great number of fans, replenished with odors and sweet smells, and threw them into the sea mingled with milk, until the ship was filled up with large gifts and prosperous devotions. The Navigium Isidis, or vessel of Isis, featured festival boats filled with offerings that represented the dismembered body of Osiris. Votaries would beat their breasts and imitate the sorrows of an unhappy mother in rites that resembled mystery plays. The Navigium Isidis appears in this fresco at Pompeii. In this image, also from the Iseum, they reflect some of the bustling mood of the watery rite. Titania's elegy channels a similar scenography, at once festive and mournful, intimately dyadic, and environmentally plentiful. The metaphoric mirroring of woman and ship miniaturizes the big-bellied sailing vessels into festival floats. The votaress herself sails upon the land, laden with trifles like a carnival wagon. The pregnant votaress, the gifts she brings, and the ships filled with luxury goods mingle in a memory theater that stages friendship as festival, sovereignty as solidarity, and coastline as concourse of souls. Although Shakespeare is unlikely to have had this beautiful passage directly in mind in Midsummer, Apuleius's description of the carnival float shares features with Cleopatra's barge at Cydnus, which in turn draws on iconography shared by Venus and Isis. So these images bob and jostle, in a shared sea of myth and meaning. In these Ovidian and Apuleian guises, Titania gleams with the breadth of creation, understood as both biodiversity and cultic diversity. Like Io and Psyche, she suffers love and loss by descending into mortal existence. Her elegy for the Indian votress is another wisdom poem, recollecting bits of worship and refiguring them in a seascape that freely merges Corinthian Roman and Indian Egyptian elements. So the speech itself becomes a Navigiem Isidis, a vessel of Isis pregnant with votive offerings that both mourn and enshrine feminine friendship within the long history of imperial power. So what about Antony and Cleopatra? What is fortuitous and fantastic in A Midsummer Night's Dream becomes historical and deliberate in Antony and Cleopatra, where myth and spectacle are instruments of state, and Eros is politicized to the point of cynicism. Staging herself as the Isis Venus of Greco-Egyptian Alexandria, Cleopatra also incorporates elements of Solomon and Sheba and Hebrew wisdom literature into her political theology. By the end of the play, Cleopatra rises into a new relationship, at once prudential and transcendental, with her own cult. I see four aspects of Isis as wisdom goddess that are potentially shared by Cleopatra and Titania: hermeneutic elegiac, translational pluralistic, cosmic elemental, and prudential medical. The hermeneutic elegiac Isis, associated by Plutarch with those catacombs that run beneath the temples of Isis, characterizes Cleopatra's elegy for Antony. A feminine hermeneutics of mourning runs through wisdom literature, epitomized by Psyche's quest for Cupid, Venus's lamentation for Adonis, and Isis's reassembly of Osiris. Recall the temples of Isis in Plutarch, divided between open alleys and dark caves. In the play, Cleopatra's monument is placed aloft in the gallery of the theater and thus partakes in Plutarch's open alleys, but it turns crypt when it houses Antony's corpse. The rezoning of that space occurs when Cleopatra and her women draw Antony's body up into her monument. As many critics have pointed out, their awkward fishing of his dead weight recalls the earlier fishing tricks that she had played on her lover. And there are intimations of Osiris here. Plutarch recounts, Isis found all other parts of Osiris's body except his privy member, for that it was immediately cast into a river and the fishes devoured it. But instead of that natural part, she made a counterfeit one called phallus, which she consecrated, and in the honor thereof, the Egyptians hold a solemn feast. Cleopatra's elegy for Antony becomes a kind of counterfeit phallus, a fashioned icon of his vexed vitality, spread-eagled across the ocean. Her hermeneutic elegiac work is also translational pluralistic, insofar as the elegy for Antony draws out the deep commonalities among Hebrew, Greek, and Egyptian wisdom literatures, as noted years ago by Janet Edelman. The most immediate biblical reference is the mighty angel come down from heaven of Revelations. But that text in turn participates in the cosmic visions of Proverbs and Psalms, where God walketh upon the wings of the wind and appointed the moon for certain seasons. Her blazon also recalls the Shulamite's praise of her lover's body in the Song of Songs. His legs are as pillars of marble set upon sockets of fine gold. So Cleopatra sounds a global classicism where pillars, fish, and dolphin crest in a phallic fantasy of self-renewing bounty and delight. The cosmic elemental flows into her great final speech. Cleopatra recalls her first Sheba-like meeting with Antony. Go, fetch my best attires. I am again for Cydnus to meet Mark Antony. And she presents her death as a bid for eternity. Give me my robe. Put on my crown. I have immortal longings in me. We might imagine her wearing both the rainbow attires that reflect the splendor of creation and the dark robe of mourning. Here is UCI New Swan actor Maya Smoot delivering this speech as part of our community seminars on Shakespeare and wisdom.
Give me my robe. Put on my crown. I have immortal longings in me. Now no more the juice of Egypt's grape shall moist this lip. Yar, yar, good Iris, quick. Methinks I hear Antony call. I see him rouse himself to praise my noble act. I hear him mock the luck of Caesar, which the gods give men to excuse their after wrath. Husband, I come. Now to that name my courage prove my title. I am fire and air. My other elements I give to baser life. So, have you done? Come then, and take the last warmth of my lip. Farewell, kind Charmian. Iris, long farewell. Have I the aspic in my lips? Dost fall? If thou and nature can so gently part, the stroke of death is as a lover's pinch, which hurts and is desired. Dost thou lie still? If thus thou vanishest, thou tells the world it is not worth leave taking. This proves me base. If first she meet the curled Antony, he'll make demand of her and spend that kiss which is my heaven to have. Come, thou mortal wretch, with thy sharp teeth, this knot intrinsicate of life at once untie. Poor venomous fool, be angry and dispatch. Oh, couldst thou speak that I might hear thee call great Caesar ass unpolicied? Oh, peace, peace. Dost thou not see my baby at my breast? That sucks the nurse asleep. Oh, sweet as balm, as soft as air, as gentle. Oh, Antony. Nay, I will take thee too. What? Should I stay?
So, if at Cydnus, Eros overshadowed Cosmos, here Cosmos absorbs Eros as Cleopatra surges into the wisdom tradition as its acolyte and priestess. This queen of Dynamos also aspires to the ousia of God's eternal being, as expressed in the inscription of Isis Athena at Sais, transcribed by Plutarch. I am all that which hath been, which is, and which shall be, and never any man yet was able to draw open my veil. William Junker compares the scene to the Jewish Torah and the Pauline letters in its summoning of a messianic temporality that is both layered and universal in its ingathering of transcendental motifs. In this Alexandrian apotheosis, the poetic pluralism of wisdom literature, which ripples at the edges of Titania's musings, fully energize Cleopatra's orchestration of her own becoming idea. Finally, there is the prudential medical aspect of Cleopatra's final transit, as Jennifer Parker has demonstrated in her wonderful essay, Discandying Cleopatra. We saw in Ovid's Amores how Isis oversaw the intimacies of reproductive life and death. The book of Cleopatra, now lost, was a medical treatise falsely attributed to the Egyptian queen, and both Christian and Islamic traditions ascribed works to Cleopatra on alchemy, cosmetics, and gynecology. So how does this material show up in the play? Cleopatra's suicide is both radically authentic and carefully researched, down to the details of her mode of dying. Octavian reports that, quote, her physician tells me she hath pursued conclusions infinite of easy ways to die. Those lines summarize a much longer account in Plutarch of Cleopatra's medical research into the best routes to an easy and also beautiful death. And how was that research conducted? It was conducted on male prisoners, part of a long history of medical science exploiting incarcerated people. A variation of Plutarch's story reappears in Tractate Nida of the Talmud, where the rabbis condemn Cleopatra's research into the origins of life, this time conducted on impregnated maidservants condemned to death. In the play, the serving women die with their queen in a suicide pact that glorifies them as well as her. In the Talmud, a very different group of maidservants are sacrificed to advance medical knowledge. So the composite Isis, Titania, Cleopatra that emerges across these diverse texts at once practices midwifery and exercises sovereign biopower at the interfaces of Jewish, Christian, Greco-Roman, and folk knowledge practices. So I have presented Isis, Titania, and Cleopatra, as well as Judeo-Greek Sophia, as curators of infinite virtue in its cosmic dance, its intercultural ambitions, and its creaturely descents. I want to end by suggesting what capacities of Shakespeare might be freshly accessed or renewed by taking up this global wisdom perspective. Well, first, this enterprise concerns the feminine character of wisdom in Shakespeare. Wisdom queens, such as Titania and Cleopatra, command distinctively female political theologies. Wisdom priestesses, such as Paulina and Thaisa, oversee temples of wisdom that are also clinics, schools, and galleries. And sapiential seekers, such as Portia, Helena, Marina, and Imogen, heal, teach, suffer, and learn. Moreover, they do so not as guides to male enlightenment, like Plato's Diotima, but as astute managers of their own capacities or virtues, which unfold in relational clusters, but remain animated by their personal intelligence and charisma, by fair virtue's force. As we move through our lives and cycle through different roles, I think there is much to be learned from these shapers and seekers of wisdom, within and beyond the social norms and moral ambiguities that constrain their virtue practices. I love this image of Psyche. It's taken from Apuleius's The Golden Ass. It's painted by Giulio Romano, And it's modeled on Michelangelo's portraits of prophets, sibyls, and Jewish ancestors in the Sistine Chapel. So there's a really deep exchange here among Hebrew, Egyptian, and Greek wisdom types. There's also an environmental and embodied dimension to wisdom. In The Veil of Isis, Pierre Hadot contrasts the Promethean conquest of nature with the Orpheus-Isis tradition. Shakespeare's wisdom ecologies are more Orphic than Promethean. They embrace various facets of experiential life, from the transcendental to the cognitive to the affective, and they handle their interaction in a world of thinking and living beings. Titania's descent to the forest floor and Cleopatra's rise into the elements offer patterns of embodiment and disembodiment that acknowledge what is sacred within us in order to affirm what is sacred around us. I'm also interested in the cosmopolitan dimensions of wisdom. Although syncretism is an instrument of empire, the search for a prisca theologica also encourages hospitality and exchange. The Egyptian sojourns of Orpheus and Pythagoras, the Afro-Platonism of Apuleius, and the translation projects of the Jews of Alexandria are all ways of reframing Shakespeare's insularity and discovering what is other in his texts. It is my contention that wisdom literature, in its variety and dignity, contributes to Shakespeare's ongoing articulation of a post-secular project that entertains the mutual enrichment of traditions beyond the policing of confessions. Hence his turn to the Eleusinian mysteries in The Winter's Tale and the Temple of Diana at Ephesus in Pericles. Acknowledging the global travels of ancient wisdom opens Shakespeare beyond Shakespeare, exposing his moral limits and then healing those breaches with the resources that a broadened mapping of tradition, that's self-invited by the imaginative reach of his plays, has to offer. Philosopher Robert Brandom calls this stance magnanimous, forgiving recollection, which folds critique into generosity and context into cosmos. Magnanimity means greatness of soul. And I believe that both the study of literature and the practice of theater are at their heart efforts in soul stretching. How can I move from mourning to magnanimity, learning from Shakespeare's plays how to respond to a landscape of pain with compassion and humility by watching his works, his characters, and his sources repair the fractured layers of history in new creative composites. In other words, infinite virtue. Thank you.